Hi, my name is Travis Campbell, and I am the president and founder of Consider This, an organization dedicated to the defense of classical Christianity. Last week, we took a look at the debate between Justin Bass and Bart Ehrman on the Unbelievable radio program, which is a channel that features various debates between Christians and non-Christians, and is hosted by Justin Brierley. I'll have the link below. But we got into it and we began critiquing Professor Bass's defense of the resurrection. This week, we're going to finish our comments on that, and we'll show some good points that Professor Bass gave in defense of the resurrection, but also offer some more critique. And so with me, as always, is my good friend, Richard Smith. Richard, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you today, Travis?
I'm doing all right. I got a comment about our last program, and it was funny. The comment was like, I like your guest, but I don't know who this guy is. Who is Richard Smith besides the name? And I will just say that I'm just proud to have you on as my co-partner in some of these episodes, and I've enjoyed your commentary so far. But I've known you since you were in high school, teaching you Sunday school as your dad pastored my church. But why don't you say a little bit more about yourself so that the audience can get to know you?
Oh, my name is Richard Smith, and I am currently in Charleston. I have a history degree and some history graduate training so far, although I'm not currently enrolled in graduate school. And I have known Travis, like you said, for a long time. His teaching in Sunday school and in apologetics and theology have saved me from a lot of potentially bad situations in college and beyond.
Well, I'm honored to hear that. I will say that talking to you at length over the years about all things historical has just been a great benefit to me. So this is one of those situations where the student has become the teacher. And the training that you've had in history, I think, makes you well prepared to not only discuss historical matters in the field that you've studied the most, the Middle Ages, but also anything historical. Anytime someone puts forth a historical argument for anything, you have the skill set to help us give an assessment. And so I'm just really happy to have you here.
And I will say also that being in the field of pre-modern history, like, it doesn't matter what era you're in, because you're still dealing with, even though we have more evidence than the Middle Ages a lot of times, sometimes we have less. It depends on what era you're talking about. But we're dealing with very often sources that don't give up their information as easily.
Yeah.
So there is sort of like a camaraderie between all the pre-modernists and the historical in the historical field.
Yeah. Whenever you're dealing with handwritten copies of documents, you're dealing with the field of textual criticism, which becomes quite difficult. It's actually difficult for modern history, but it's even doubly, triply so when you're talking about pre-modern history. So
I find a lot of times in modern history, the modern historian just has such a wealth of riches that they can hardly choose what's important and what's not sometimes.
Sure.
So you just have so many sources, and they can sometimes drown out what's important. It's interesting.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Now, I mean, it's in terms of what you're doing nowadays, I think the most interesting thing in terms of what you're doing and is where you are. Charleston is a great town. I hear that the food there is just fantastic. Just so many great restaurants.
Yes, there are very many good restaurants in Charleston, indeed.
My wife keeps scolding me. I mean, I'm a Southerner, but I've never been to Charleston, so maybe soon we can go up there and have you show us around.
I would love to have you up here. It's a lovely little city.
Well, look, we've been looking at this debate between Ehrman and Bass, and I think that we've started to give some criticisms of Justin Bass, but he does shine here and there in this debate. We're going to point some of that out, but do you have anything you want to say before we kind of jump into it again?
No, let's get on into it.
All right. Well, here we are once again looking at yet another exchange between Bart Ehrman and Justin Bass. Let's take a look.
I'm saying that historians establish what probably happened on the past on the basis of probabilities. If the probability is 1 out of 800 billion or something versus 1 out of 8, well, what do historians think about that? Do they think it's more likely that the laws of physics are broken? Even they grant, okay, laws of physics, suppose they grant that. Do they say it did happen in this one instance because we have these 3 people who said it happened? Or do they say maybe they missaw something?
Okay. Justin, and then we'll move on to your next bedrock.
You know, we talked about, 107 billion people, that have walked the planet. That's fine. Out of those 107 billion people, how many of those people, those human beings, are worshipped by billions of people and called Lord and God today?
I don't know what the number is.
One.
So 107 billion. So how many?
How
many of those have been?
Let me finish my.
No.
This is my turn. This is my turn.
Okay.
I thought
I'll let you respond.
I thought you wanted me to respond.
Jesus is the only.
You asked me a question.
Okay.
You asked me a question. You wanted to know how many, and I was trying to answer your question. So may I answer?
Tell me someone else other than
Okay.
Jesus that's worshipped by billions.
I'm answering by asking you.
Oh no! See, that's not. You weren't answering the question.
Okay, I will answer the question.
So let me at least
Of those
finish my point.
107 billion, you can't say that more people worship Jesus now, therefore he was raised from the dead.
Okay.
Because let me
You have to
finish.
let me finish my point.
I'm
making a point.
answering your question.
You weren't answering
You
the
asked me
question.
my question,
Okay.
and
I'll
I'm
let you
answering
finish.
it. Let me
Bart
finish my question.
and then you can.
You say 107 billion, and since more people worship Jesus now, that's evidence.
No,
Oh,
that's not what I
okay,
said.
then I
Okay,
guess
so let me
understand.
finish.
Okay.
You asked
So- So I'm saying what we have here is an extraordinary, by exactly these exact odds that you're talking about. We have an extraordinary anomaly. We have one human being who walked this earth from the last, billions of years, and however long humans have been on the earth. Out of 107 billion, this one human being is worshipped by billions and called Lord and God. I'm saying that is an extraordinary anomaly, and so I'm saying that's something that historians would go, "Wow, that kind of is amazing." If Jesus achieved that extraordinary anomaly, 1 out of 107 billion on that point, maybe he achieved another extraordinary anomaly. Maybe he rose from the dead.
Okay.
Are you really
Bart.
using that as a historical argument?
I'm using it as an argument for the resurrection, whatever you want to call it.
What kind of
You
argument
don't-
would you call it?
Well, what's the problem with the argument?
But isn't it an
That-
extraordinary anomaly that Jesus is worshipped by billions? How is a crucified
No,
man?
it's not an anomaly at all. I wrote an entire book explaining how it happened.
Okay, how does a crucified
Without
man in
a
his
single miracle.
mid-30s, how is he worshipped by billions of people today? I mean, you don't think that's not an extraordinary anomaly?
It's not an anomaly.
It's by
amazing.
definition, at mathematics, 1 out of 107 billion.
Why is that proof that he was raised from the dead? It's proof that people are convinced he
I
was
didn't.
raised from the dead.
I said it's a good argument against this idea that you were making that, oh, you're telling me only one person out of all the 107 billion rose from the dead? A historian can't say that. That's not good enough evidence. Well, here's another point on that same person that is an
But you
extraordinary
can't
anomaly.
explain that one. You can explain why there are so many billions of Christians in the world. It's not hard to explain
But
without a miraculous explanation. So why? I don't understand why you're arguing this.
But this single individual has had this kind of impact.
Yes, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
Oh, it's amazing.
So it's normal for crucified men in the
Of
ancient
course, it's
world
not
that are
normal.
Jews
It's
to be worshipped by
completely
billions
anomalous.
and
But
lay
that
the
doesn't-
foundations of
but that
Western
doesn't mean that he
civilization.
was
This is
raised-
normal.
You are not listening to me. The resurrection of Jesus would be a miracle of God. You can't use the fact that many people became convinced of that miracle to prove that the miracle happened.
Okay.
You can only use that to show that people were convinced it happened. There are other reasons people get convinced by things other than the fact that God intervened in history.
Okay, but don't you see the point that if Jesus did rise from the dead, that would be a pretty good answer to why he has had this extraordinary anomaly impact on the
No,
world.
I don't think it has any relevance to it.
All right, Richard, what do you think?
I think Bart Ehrman is right on this one. And I also think that this section of the interview is probably the most, or the debate is probably the most embarrassing, because
Yeah.
Justin Bass is just being rude the entire time. While Ehrman is answering the question he asked, and answering it well.
Yeah, I've gone over it several times, and here's one way to set up, I think, the kind of argument Justin Bass wants to set up. Here's one way to set up an argument for the resurrection. You can say, I'm searching for meaning in life. I'm trying to find out what religion I may or may not want to follow. And I keep reading about this Jesus. If you go into the Encyclopedia Britannica or Wikipedia, or you look at what people do, I notice there's something about him. Assuming he lived at all, there is no human being that's ever lived that has had the kind of impact he has had. There are between 2 and 3 billion Christians who worship him as God on some level or another. And then there's another 1.5 to 2 billion Muslims who hail him as the Messiah. Now, in and of itself, that didn't prove anything, but that does prove one thing. This man made a huge impact. I should look into him. So I don't think that approach is irrational at all. I mean, in fact, I think that is a great segue into, well, who is he? Who really is this man, Jesus? Did he even live in the first place? And you start getting into all of that stuff. But to say that because a billion people worship him, ergo, therefore, he rose from the dead, which is exactly what Bass is trying to say, is just wrong. I will give him some of the benefit of the doubt, because at one point in the discussion, he says, I'm answering your contention, Dr. Ehrman, because you're saying that the probability of one man rising from the dead is so low. Why? Because however many billions of people have lived on this planet, 800 billion or whatever it is, you're telling me that only one experienced the resurrection? And his response is, well, we do know one thing about him. Out of the billions and billions of people that have lived on planet Earth, he's the only one that's ever been worshipped to the degree that humans have worshipped another human being. So I can see what he was trying to do with it. He's saying we are talking about a unique person here. But then Ehrman says, are you really offering this as an establishment or as some sort of historical argument for the resurrection? And he said yes, and then he later says no. Did we get the clip where he said, no, I'm not using it as an argument for the resurrection? Bass does contradict himself at some point in this discussion. So
yeah, I think he said no because he thought that he was saying Bart didn't understand what he was saying.
okay,
if I remember correctly.
right.
It's been a while since.
Well, I mean, Professor Ehrman is confused on. I mean, I think a lot of us are confused because Bass is not making his point clear. If he's trying to make the benign point that this is a unique individual we're talking about, so yeah, it is true that out of 800 billion or so many people that have lived on planet Earth, none have risen from the dead except for Jesus. True, but then again, out of the 800 billion that have lived on planet Earth, none have been worshipped as God except for Jesus, at least on this level. I guess you could say, well, pharaohs have been worshipped as God, and a couple of lamas over in Egypt, a
few Roman emperors.
But in terms of just the sheer volume of people that have worshipped another man, a humble carpenter from Nazareth to boot, we're not talking about just anybody. And incidentally, this is an argument that Wolfhard Pannenberg, it's not an argument, but it's at least a consideration he gave. He said, it's not just anyone that we're saying rose from the dead. It's Jesus of Nazareth, whose ministry and claims were such that he at least becomes a candidate for such an action. So
Yes. Yeah, and I will say, I completely 100% agree on all of Bass's premises here. But I think I have to agree with Ehrman that it's not an argument that's going to convince any historian. It just isn't.
sure.
We see so many, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but there are so many examples of charismatic figures who have got millions of people to follow them that most historians would all agree, and we would agree, lied or were not telling the truth or were madmen.
Well, look, I will. I want to stop on this one just for a second and just kind of dwell on it just for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we talked about this a little bit last week when we got into the issue of what about Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism and Judaism? What about these other charismatic leaders? Are you going to agree with all the purported miracles that they've performed? And my answer, as I said last week, was, well, I'm not necessarily going to agree with any purported miracle that is ascribed to someone. But I am duty bound, because I'm open to the miraculous, I'm duty bound to accept any miracle that passes muster historically. And so if you can show me that another person has performed a miracle that fits the kind of criteria that we're talking about, consistency alone would force me to go ahead and say that that miracle happened. And I can't use some later down the road theological conclusion to come to retroactively rule out any other miracle that's going to happen. That would beg all kinds of questions.
Mm-hmm.
But I may be repeating myself from last week, maybe not, but there is a question that some people will raise, like, say, an Elvis sighting. Or I think David Hume gave the question about Queen Elizabeth. What if we had evidence that Queen Elizabeth's tomb was empty a few days after she died and that people saw her, blah, blah, blah? Let's say we had a kind of parallel to what happened to Jesus when it came to Queen Elizabeth I. Would you think that she rose from the dead? And my answer would be no. It's like, what? Well, you're being inconsistent here. You're not going to accept Queen Elizabeth, but you're going to accept Jesus. What's the difference? And this is where William Lane Craig's work on the argument for the resurrection during the deist controversy was very helpful to me, because one of the things that our Christian brothers, that defended the faith against the deists back in the 18th century, what they said was, look, it's not just that some guy rose from the dead. It's a man who had a sociological and more particularly ethical and more particularly messianic impact on his community. This is a person of religious significance who made specific claims. And one of the facts that serves as our background knowledge in assessing these things, and it's a fact that I don't know if Bart Ehrman accepts, but it's a broadly accepted fact. In fact, Marcus Borg reports that the majority of New Testament critics believe that Jesus was going around doing extraordinary things in his life. And my favorite quote of the Jesus Seminar is that Jesus healed at least one blind man. But why does the Jesus Seminar, as radically skeptical as they are, why do they accept that about Jesus? Because there's so many layers of traditional material in the gospel tradition that, it doesn't matter where you turn, whether it's in Mark or in Luke's source or Matthew's source, you just see it everywhere. And even in the sayings of Jesus. So you have it in Q, you have it in John, you have it everywhere where Jesus is making extraordinary claims and he's doing extraordinary deeds. He becomes a candidate for quite possibly the recipient of or the actor of a miracle. By actor of a miracle, I mean he was doing miracles. Now, you can't beg the question in this and say, look, before I get to the resurrection, look, he was doing these miracles. Well, there are natural explanations for healing a blind person. It could have been a psychosomatic cure or something. So this is why a lot of your critics are willing to grant that it's historical. But once I know that the resurrection happened, I can look back and say, well, this is a man that was actually probably doing miracles. We know that God was now active in his life. So the extraordinary deeds and claims and ethical teachings and religious theological content that just enveloped his life, that becomes a reason to think that he could be a candidate for a resurrection, that God could have intervened in his life and done something miraculous for him. And then when we have all these lines of evidence, the facts of the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the faith of the disciples that was life-changing for them, the question is, are there good naturalistic explanations of these? And it turns out that most skeptics say no. They're agnostic as to what happened to Jesus after he died. And we actually can make a positive case that Jesus experienced the resurrection, that is the best explanation of the known facts of history. So all of that, you can't just say, okay, there are these three facts, the empty tomb, post-mortem appearances, and the disciples' faith that need to explain, and go on with your argument. You have to enter into it with this background knowledge, not only a belief that there is a God who can perform a miracle, but that Jesus himself came on the historical scene with this unparalleled authority. He spoke in God's place. He forgave sins. He had table fellowship with sinners, implying that he took on the prerogative of forgiving sins, that he claimed to be the Messiah, which is something that Ehrman would grant, that the historical Jesus believed he was the Messiah. And he did these extraordinary deeds. All of that plays a role in your background knowledge. And I'll say one more thing, and then please pipe in if you think you want to say something. But I don't agree with the minimal facts proponents who were not using the empty tomb as part of their case. Gary Habermas, Mike Licona, when they usually debate, and Bass doesn't emphasize this, because there's a significant minority of critics, it's about 25% or so, that don't think that the tomb was empty, or at least they don't think that the evidence warrants belief in an empty tomb. Habermas and Licona have led the minimal facts proponents into not using it in their case for the resurrection. I think you have to have that fact in place.
It certainly seals up a lot of other possibilities.
Yeah. Because, if the disciples experienced hallucinations, okay, fine, but how do you explain the empty tomb? You have a very complex composite theory to explain what happened to Jesus, which is all good if there is no God. If naturalism is true, then so be it. The natural explanations are the better explanations anyway. But once you have an empty tomb and the appearances and this weird belief in a resurrection that takes place in the middle of history, you have something you have to explain. And unfortunately, Bass doesn't exploit that.
No, yeah. When I was first watching this debate, I was thinking, like, okay, he's going to build his argument up.
Yeah.
And eventually the evidence is going to roll down the hill and win the argument. But he doesn't do that. It's a very sort of piecemeal argument. Doesn't really bring things together as a whole.
Yeah.
And part of it is, I think, one of them is this one argument, right? That Jesus has had such a great influence in history. And like I said, I completely agree with all of Bass's statements there, but I don't think that's an historical argument. And you have to use the historical facts to build up to why that's significant. Right.
Have you read J. Warner Wallace's Person of Interest?
No, I have not.
J. Warner Wallace has become fairly famous in apologetical circles because he was a skeptic who it was also a detective. He was a detective.
Okay.
He's
seen
he's
his,
a cold case detective. So when a murder case goes cold, it may be 5, 10, 20 years, but since there's no statute of limitations, they're always willing to reopen a case. And so a person of interest in a murder trial is someone who's not being formally accused, but he is a person of interest. She is a person of interest. The police are really looking into this person because there's some shady evidence around them that may not be enough to convict, but it's something that's going to raise an eyebrow, and they're going to start really looking into that person. So it's a way of kind of weeding out. You could potentially investigate everybody on the planet whenever a murder takes place, but if you're in Timbuktu and the murder happened in LA, and you were in Timbuktu, then you're not a really good candidate. But a person of interest, they will always start with someone who's close to the scene of the crime. If a woman dies at 12 o'clock midnight in a bed in her home in the master bedroom, and the husband was there all night and he didn't die,
yes,
he's a pretty good candidate. So he becomes a person of interest. Well, person of interest is one of the later works of J. Warner Wallace, and the question is Jesus the product of a divine conspiracy in the best sense of the term, or is he just some regular person? And he looks at all the events that led up to Jesus being born, and then the historical impact that Jesus had afterwards. And it's a part of a cumulative case. And there he gets into the prophecies and just the fact that Jesus is the paradigm of morality, and then the tremendous impact that he had afterwards. J. Warner Wallace's argument is an interesting argument, and I think Bass may have been thinking about what Warner Wallace is doing in making his argument with Bart Ehrman. But Ehrman is right. Part of what Bass is doing is theology, which is fine. But that's what he's doing. He's not doing history. And Ehrman's about to raise a point that I guess we're going to get into. Well, there's another religion that has spread just as fast as Christianity, if not faster. Why don't you believe it? But you want to say one more thing before I show this clip?
No, I'm ready to see the clip.
All right, well, then let's look at this clip here. This is the last thing that we'll show of the debate, and I just want to encourage the viewers to look at the whole thing. We're just looking at clips of it and making comments. But here's the next and the very last clip we'll show here. Bass giving yet another consideration in Ehrman's counter response.
Let me put it like this, okay? So the Mormon Church, back to the Mormons for a second. The early Christian movement from the days of Paul up to when Constantine converted, okay? It grew, if you actually just crunch the numbers, like you start out just say in Paul's day, I would say before, say right after the resurrection, there are like 20 people, okay, who believe in you. You got the 11 disciples, you got a handful, say there's 20 people.
20 to 3 billion. Yeah.
So by the time you get to Constantine, by the time he converts, there's probably 5 or 6 million Christians in the world. So if you crunch the growth rate, like, what would it take to get from 20 to 5 or 6 million at that time? It's about 30% every decade. Okay. And so the question is, does that require a miracle or not? Or can you explain it by natural routes? The Mormon Church has grown that rate since it was founded by Joseph Smith. Now, I wouldn't want to say that Mormonism is necessarily true because it grew at that rate, or that the angel Moroni necessarily revealed the golden, but because it grew at that rate. If Christianity had continued to grow at that rate after Constantine, by the end of the 4th century, there would have been more Christians than humans in the world. So the rate of growth, or the number of people who come to believe in something, is not an indication of the miraculous beginnings of the faith.
But I didn't say that. I'm asking you. You did not give me an extraordinary anomaly for Mormonism. I gave you an extraordinary anomaly for Jesus of Nazareth.
The extraordinary anomaly is that the angel Moroni showed Joseph Smith these plagues.
No, but
That's never happened before.
but no
Out
one
of
is,
107 billion people in the world, that has never happened to anybody.
We're back to the same point. Nobody outside of those people believe that.
Either do
Moroni has
the
not
people who
appeared
believe in
to anyone
Jesus. The people believe in Jesus' resurrection are Christians.
Well, no. Skeptics and unbelievers all around the world have been convinced by the
They've
resurrection of
converted,
Jesus.
and they've been converted to Mormonism.
Oh, well, in Utah, yeah.
No, you're not hearing me again.
I know.
30%
But
growth
they're
rate.
working off, on that point, they're working off Christian capital. I mean, it's a cult of Christianity. So
Well,
they're
you
working
could
off
argue
Christian
that Christianity is working off of Jewish capital.
I mean, can
capital.
we?
Judaism didn't spread.
I know we've kind of wandered into this final bedrock fact, and I just want you to establish it, though, just for the listening and watching audience, Justin. Just talk about this, why you believe that the rise of Christianity, or as you put it, the rise of the Nazarenes, constitutes not just a fact of history, but something that points towards the truth of the resurrection.
Well, I think one point that I wanted to make that centers around that is, again, Jesus. I mean, again, we're dealing with a person, not just anybody that rose from the dead, but the most influential, the most sung about, the most painted, the most written about, great moral teacher, the most compassionate, the most extraordinary figure, who's ever lived. And so I think that's an important point to make, that this is who we're saying rose from the dead, right? We're not just saying any old Joe rose from the dead. And so again, I think that's why Jesus keeps tipping the boxes for all these extraordinary anomalies.
I'm not getting it.
So are you saying it's a combination of things? It's that they claim this unprecedented claim in that Jewish culture that a crucified Messiah had been raised from the dead. The fact that people truly believe that it's seen that, the fact that it happened to someone who has had this extraordinary influence on culture, human rights, everything else, and that movement now comprises easily a third of the world's population, whatever it is.
But let me.
So, Richard, thoughts about this next part, where Ehrman basically parallels the rise of Christianity with Mormonism. To wit, Christianity rose about 30% per decade up until Constantine. Mormonism is growing about that rate per decade now. So if you say one is miraculous, you have to say another is miraculous.
Yeah, I think he has actually a very good point, and he would have a very good point, because this kind of shows why this is not a very good argument for the resurrection, right? Because we actually historically have, in my opinion, we have basically disproven Mormonism historically, And this is kind of important because he also mentions it earlier in the debate, that there are these four witnesses. What do you say about these four witnesses? Well, these four witnesses are great for Mormonism, but we have actually Joseph Smith claimed to translate a bunch of documents, and this is coming from an Egyptologist named Robert Rittner, who wrote an article on his blog basically responding to the Latter-day Saints' views, because we have basically the source for one of the books that Joseph Smith claims was revelation from God, the Book of Abraham. And that source, as Rittner proves, is in fact a book of Egyptian religious poetry about Set and Osiris. And the reason we know that this is the manuscript is because he helpfully copied some pictures for us from the manuscript that he said were depicting Abraham and a fictional pharaoh that he made up. He copied them, and they're the ones on the manuscript, on the papyrus that we have. So we know for a fact that he is mislabeling them. We translated the document. The Mormon Church agrees that this was at least a part of the set of documents that he said had the writings of Abraham on it. But the real smoking gun here, is that we have the translation notes for the Book of Abraham. And we know the translation notes for the Book of Abraham because if we match up the papyri, some of the hieroglyphs on the papyri and the translation notes, they are in the same order.
Really?
Yes, we have that. The Mormon Church published that before they found this papyrus. They found it in 1967. And the Mormon Church was extremely happy. They're like, we're finally going to be able to prove that what we say is true. and it turns out it's an already known existent book of Egyptian poetry. And Brittner does an extremely good job in this article. I encourage you to look it up. It's in the. I'll post a link in the description below or in the comments. It is on the University of Chicago website. So now the Mormon Church, obviously, there are two options that they seem to take, from what I can understand, from reading what little I have of their apologetics. They either say, this is not the scroll, but what do you do with the notes? What do you do with the pictures? They match. And it's sometimes they'll argue that, well, that picture obviously wasn't meant to be a part of that same manuscript. But then if you look at the Book of Abraham, Joseph Smith in the Book of Abraham references that picture. He says, look at this picture of Abraham, if you don't believe me, basically. That's a paraphrase. But so, even though we have these witnesses, and even though we have this growth, we know that Mormonism isn't true by Joseph Smith's own logic, because he lied about his own revelation, or else he was very mistaken about whether it was revelation. So we know that the Mormon Church is not.
That is astounding. I did not know about that until you shared this with me. I do know, I believe that it is Martin Harris who funded the production of the Book of Mormon, who left the Mormon movement, at least for a season.
Mm-hmm.
Was not he defected. I believe he may have come back near the end of his life, but the point is, he was one of the main witnesses who would have been a part of the
yes.
And he had a defection, which I mean, what if we had a situation where one in the let's say we had a bona fide papyrus that was found in the 1st century, and after years of debate, we realized it's authentic and it tells the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the story of how Andrew, Peter's brother, abandoned the faith. Yeah, that would be a deal. If that's not a deal breaker for me, it would certainly take me to the edge. I mean, that would really shake my faith if one of the founders of Christianity not disagree. You know, if you have founders disagreeing with each other on how to do something, that's one thing. So Paul's confronting Peter in Galatians 2. Some people make a big deal out of that. I don't see that as a big deal. But if we had a manuscript or papyrus of Peter or Paul, you know, here's the real story. They defected at the end of their life. They didn't die a martyr's death, as we've always been told. Well, then that would be a shocker, and I would have to, you know, I would have to go home and really rethink my faith.
And that's not even
have that for Mormonism.
Yeah, that's not even a correct analogy for what we have. We have even more evidence than the witnesses leaving and coming back. We have. It's like if we found what we knew was the source for the Gospels, Synoptic Gospels, and then it was completely different from anything, but we knew it for sure. Like we saw Matthew and Mark or whoever wrote them, because it wouldn't have been Matthew and Mark probably if we found a false source for the Gospels. But like it's like if we found a source and then we translated it, it said something completely different, wasn't even about Jesus, it was about instead it was about Zoroaster or something.
Right.
And then
there you go.
That's exactly what we have found for Mormonism. We have found that the Mormonistic one of the Mormonistic Gospels is in fact just pagan literature, and he just pretended to translate it.
So to clean up your analogy, it would, you know, Myth Vision and even Pologia and some of these anti-Christian YouTube channels, they spend a lot of time trying to draw parallels between Christianity and these pagan savior gods. Robert Price, until fairly recently, was instrumental and kind of building up the case that you have going on over at Myth Vision, Derek Lambert. And the parallels, according to the majority of New Testament scholars, are spurious. I mean, most people don't take that seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And even Bart Ehrman was on Myth Vision not too long ago, basically saying, well, no, there really are no pagan parallels with the virgin birth. There are no pagan parallels with the resurrection because, I mean, those other pagan gods actually had sex with these virgins. So these are deflowering narratives. They're not virgin births. They're not virginal conceptions. So it's not a real parallel. But what if we discovered Luke's home? The very guy that wrote the Gospel of Luke, and we saw his sources. And in his library, we saw these scrolls with just all of these references to these savior gods, and he's writing lines of his gospel in between the lines of this old scroll of some pagan literature. That's kind of what you're saying that we found for.
Yeah, basically. Mm-hmm. Except he couldn't even. Joseph Smith couldn't even understand the Egyptian hieroglyphs because Egypt. This is why he could pretend to translate them, right? Because they hadn't figured it out quite yet.
Do you know who Peter J. Williams is?
I think I've read. Isn't he in your notes in one of your?
Probably.
Yeah.
He's a Christian thinker, scholar, and a few years ago there was a documentary out called I think it was called The Book of Mormon and DNA. There's probably on YouTube, and I'll give a link below, but it's hilarious because at one point they're asking these scholars about the original language of the golden plates, which was a reformed Egyptian. And I don't know why this humors me, but I'm always tickled when really smart people are dumbfounded. Like I've never heard of that before, because if some of these guys, some scholars are just the types that if they haven't heard of it, there's a decent chance that's because it's not there.
Yeah, because they're so well read in their field. Yes,
they're so well read in their field, and so they asked Peter Williams. Does this surprise? I can't remember exactly how they word the question, but it was something to the effect of, "Does it surprise you that Joseph Smith was able to learn Reformed Egyptian?" And Peter Williams is like, "What is Reformed Egyptian? Never. It's a made-up language. I mean, there's no such thing as Reformed Egyptian." And this documentary, for people who don't know, I mean, the Mormon Church teaches that the Native American population that populated the Western Hemisphere, this all started in 600 BC, 590 BC, when the Jews were escaping Jerusalem, they sailed to America. And what's interesting is the route that they took was via the Pacific. They didn't go straight across the Med to the Atlantic. It's my understanding that they took the Pacific. And it's like there's a lot of land that they could have run into and sort of stopped. But no, they went all the way to Central America, and from there populated the Western Hemisphere. Well, we've done DNA studies of bones that preceded Columbus's voyage, and we know one thing for sure. Not a single Jew touched the Western Hemisphere until after 1500. We know this. And so how do you reconcile that with the notion that Native Americans wrote the Book of Mormon? Well, that too is another smoking gun.
Yeah, and so it's really interesting. There is one argument that the Mormon apologists can still hold to, even though we do not think that, or we know that this is the source of the Book of Abraham. They say that when Joseph Smith said he translated it, and when he said it was the writings of Abraham and Joseph, he didn't really mean translate, and he didn't really mean that they were the writings of Abraham and Joseph.
Right.
translate just meant he was inspired by the Egyptian hieroglyphs about pagan things to a higher level of understanding, and he was able to reconstruct the true Book of Abraham. I'm sorry, I can't say that without laughing a little bit. I apologize. But like, so the problem with this is we have diary entries of his followers. Mormons were really good about writing in their diaries, and they were like, well, he told us that he found the scrolls that contained the writings of the Book of Abraham and Joseph, and that he was busy translating them. They didn't have any reason to lie to us.
Yeah, they were just saying this is what the prophets. This is what the prophets working on these days.
Yeah, that's like so. So
Acquiring,
he's lying to his followers,
acquiring new wives,
yeah,
and translating ancient texts. I mean, it's it's good to be the prophet. It's good to be the prophet. Well,
yes.
Bass, there is an interesting exchange here, though, going back to this, which incidentally, any one of the points that we just made, the DNA, is it Vickers? Is that the article? Who's the scholar that wrote the article that you're referencing? Rittner, sorry. Mm-hmm. So Professor Rittner, his expose of the so-called ancient texts upon which the Book of Mormon is based, and then just some of these other little anecdotes, that's enough to sort of bring Mormonism into doubt. If someone like Robert Price is correct, and that there wasn't even an Apostle Paul, I think Christianity would be done for. I mean, if Paul didn't exist and didn't write those epistles, it's that alone is enough to say that Christianity is just built on a major lie, because one of the great facts that we know about the founding Christianity is the skeptic, the enemy of the church, Paul converted, which is in and of itself a powerful testimony. And when you begin to unpack it, it becomes evidence. In and of itself, it's not evidence, but when you begin to unpack it, it becomes just one piece of evidence that you can lay down as you're arguing for the resurrection. If that's not true, if the Gospels are in fact of the genre of myth, then we're dealing with a religion that has no historical basis whatsoever. Even if the Book of Acts gets incidental details here and there correct. I mean, so does Spider-Man, as I've said before. So there are ways, if there are parallels between the Book of Mormon or the founding of Mormonism and Christianity, I think that we would be done for, because I think it is fairly obvious that Mormonism just can't be true. But most scholars, at least, don't see that. That doesn't mean they're right, but most scholars, when they're studying, and these are people outside of Christianity, when they're studying these, they at least grant the facts, even if they're not going to grant the fact upon which Christianity is based, the resurrection. They're going to grant that Jesus did extraordinary things, and he was buried in this tomb, and so on. But then there's this interesting thing that Bass said, which I thought was an interesting point. He said, well, Mormonism is building off of Christian capital. So one of the reasons why Mormonism was able to spread is because they were building off of the already established church. And Joseph Smith postured himself as giving us the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, basically saying that all the versions of Christianity are corruptions of the original article, and I'm here to call you back to what Jesus really meant to say.
And if you just to give you a point, because I've been spending a bit of time on the Latter-day Saints website, if you look at their at their site about Joseph Smith, one of the first points they bring up about him is, oh, he's from a Christian background. So they are still. I completely agree with Bass that they are using Christian capital here, but I would say that is, again, not a good argument to use here with
Right.
with Ehrman. I just
Who then responds, well, then Christianity is building off of the capital
Mhm.
that Judaism has laid down, which has truth to it because the founders of the church were Jews. But what's interesting, you and I said this last week, and it bears repeating, that there is something going on though with Jesus, and that is before he came, the average Gentile was worshiping a finite deity or an idol. Whatever they were worshiping, they certainly were not worshiping the God of Israel. And after Jesus came, it's a weird thing. And we have church fathers that are commenting on this. This is unprecedented. Gentiles are flocking in droves to worship the God of Israel. And what is the black box there? What happened?
Yeah.
And it's Jesus. He happened. So there is, they're working off Jewish capital, and the first converts to Christianity among the Gentiles were the God-fearers. We have that recorded in the book of Acts, where we had these Gentiles who were not in the covenant community, but they were called God-fearers because they were attracted to what the Christians were saying about the God that they were recognizing as existent. So you can say that they were building off of Jewish capital, but there is a unique thing that happens that I don't know if can ever be repeated. So, the other thing that I would have said to Ehrman is, well, do you grant that the notion of a resurrection of a single righteous man in history is something that the Jews were not anticipating? I mean, N.T. Wright wrote a whole book about it, The Resurrection of the Son of God, and he just basically goes through all of the potential ways that there were precedents for this, and he wasn't able to find any. That this is a unique proclamation that a single man in history has been raised from the dead and has experienced the resurrection. This is not a resuscitation like Elisha's, like the bones. A dead man was thrown into a tomb, and they touch Elisha's bones, and he rises from the dead. This is not Jairus's daughter or Lazarus. Those individuals went back to their graves. They died again. Jesus is raised to never die again, and the Jews didn't believe that. They believed that when the resurrection happened, it would happen to all the righteous at the end of the age, which is why Thomas doesn't believe. He doesn't reject the resurrection, as I've said before, because he's a first century David Hume who doesn't believe in miracles. He doesn't believe because this is not what we believe as Jews concerning the resurrection. So they're not building off of Jewish capital in that sense. So I guess there are two problems with Ehrman's response. So I do give a point to Bass on that score, that there's not a close enough parallel between Christianity and Mormonism. Even the 30% growth rate, I don't really say captures exactly what's going on in the founding of the church. But again and again and again, I say it's a way of wading into the evidence for the resurrection, but it certainly cannot be a part of the actual evidence for the resurrection.
No.
Well, we've gone at it, I think when all is said and done, close to an hour, 45 minutes to an hour or so. And here's what I'm going to do next week. I am actually going to go through all of Bart Ehrman's facts, those facts that he himself grants. And we're just going to ask ourselves, can you make a case for the resurrection on the basis of the facts he grants? And if not, how should we engage a person like Bart Ehrman? Most Christians and even most unbelievers are not going to run into a scholar of his caliber where they have these discussions. But you you can run into a lot of skeptics out there who are just not going to grant a lot of these facts. How can you, what can you say to move them, nudge them forward a little bit into maybe strongly considering an actual case for the resurrection? So that's what we're going to do next week. And then in the following weeks, I'm going to lay down the groundwork for the study of our harmony, where we're going to look at the Gospels, whether they were written by eyewitnesses and that sort of thing. So we have some fun stuff coming up ahead. Anything you want to say before we check out?
Always a pleasure, Travis.
It's always a pleasure. And I want to thank all of you for joining me for this. This is our one of our earliest shows. I think it's our third one in this series. And just thank you. If you are appreciating what we're doing, please hit like and please hit the subscribe button below. It'll really help us out. And I would just like to wish all of you a good weekend. And please come back next week as we start to roll up our sleeves and get into some facts that we can know for sure about this man we call Jesus of Nazareth. Thank you.